the new treaties really highlighted these weapons they've always been immoral, now they're actually illegal. And I think it's really about stigmatising these weapons, getting people to understand that they are totally unacceptable. And as I said, most people will be astonished to find their superannuation money is contributing to these weapons being built.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we are going to talk about one of the biggest sources of wealth in Australia. Superannuation is massive in this country, with more than $3 trillion, that's trillion with a T, more than $3 trillion worth of funds under management as of June this year. This is Australia's retirement money, and super funds invest in all sorts of things, including, as we found out, companies involved in nuclear weapons.
Titan II, the largest and the most powerful ballistic missile in our arsenal.
More than 70 years since atomic bombs were used over Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The organization, also known as ICANN, was rewarded with the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize.
The Nobel Committee praised ICANN's efforts towards securing the 2017 UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Nuclear weapons are illegal now because of this treaty. Having nuclear weapons, developing nuclear weapons, using nuclear weapons, and when they continue this behaviour, there will be a strong condemnation from the international community.
Australia argued it would be inconsistent with our US alliance obligations and would not eliminate a single nuclear weapon.
71 members of the Labor Party caucus who have welcomed the UN nuclear weapon ban treaty and have been prepared to work with ICANN to see it implement.
We are quite simply people who are shocked that even after 7 decades, nuclear weapons are still threatening all of us.
So, to discuss the Australia Institute's new report, co-authored by the Institute and the Quit Nukes campaign, I'm delighted to introduce Liam Carter, an Anne Cantor Fellow and co-author of the report here at the Australia Institute. Hello, Liam.
G'day, Ebony.
Margaret Beavis is a GP, co-chair of ICANN Australia, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, or ICANN, and also a director of Quit Nukes. G'day, Margaret.
G'day.
And Bill Brown, senior researcher at the Australia Institute's Democracy and Accountability Program. G'day, Bill.
Thanks for having me.
Margaret Beavis, I'll start with you. What does this research tell us about how Australia's superannuation is invested?
Well, it's really quite surprising to find that most superannuation funds have investments in nuclear weapons. A lot of funds, the majority of funds, in fact, exclude controversial weapons. So that's weapons like chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, but surprisingly still have investments in nuclear weapons. This sort of ignores the fact that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force earlier this year and has outlawed these weapons under international law. In fact, the majority of the funds, the biggest category was funds that do quite ethically exclude controversial weapons from their portfolio, but still astonishingly have investments in nuclear weapons companies produce. Well, the companies we talk about are ones involved in the production or support of nuclear weapons. So we found about 9 funds highlight their exclusion to controversial weapons to their fund members, but do invest. A couple of funds say very explicitly that we don't invest in nuclear weapons, but in fact then put what's called a percentage threshold on it, which means that they say if a company earns less than 25% of their income from nuclear weapons, we'll still invest in them, which doesn't really sound like exclusion. And then there are about 5 funds who just exclude nuclear weapons from their socially or environmentally responsible option, but they then have nuclear weapons in their general option. So it's interesting, they recognise that they're socially responsible and ethical, but they don't actually exclude them across the board. Disappointingly, there are another couple of funds who say they exclude nuclear weapons, but in fact only exclude companies in certain countries. So again, they say they don't have nuclear weapons, but they do still have investments in these companies.
So, Liam, if I can ask you, what was the process that you went about to try and discover these companies? How was the research pulled together?
So initially what we did was we drew on research from a group called Don't Bank on the Bomb, which is based in the Netherlands. And they've done some really good research, actually figuring out which of these companies are responsible for the production of nuclear weapons, which of these companies are involved in the actual production of them, or maybe it's the production of weapon systems that are built deliberately to deliver these nuclear weapons to their targets. And out of that, you end up coming up with a list of a range of different companies. And some of these companies might be more well-known to the average Australian, companies like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, the sort of large arms dealers that we're quite familiar with.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
Yeah, many of the buildings around Canberra where we're currently recording from.
That's right.
But some of these companies are also state-owned, such as the China National Nuclear Corporation, and they're quite interesting geographical spread as well. So quite a lot of them are major US manufacturers, others are based in Europe, and there are also a couple of producers from Italy and India as well. But that research was largely done for us to a large extent, which was really helpful. And the process that we went through was essentially looking at this group of companies and seeing whether any of these superannuation funds had holdings in these companies, had, I guess, essentially shares in these companies.
Yeah.
And so the superannuation funds that we chose all offered MySuper products. And MySuper products are essentially the default superannuation product that a fund needs to offer in order to be the default superannuation choice for employers.
Yep.
So they're very, very popular funds amongst Australians. And so we chose the top 20 or so funds, and we really methodically went through all of their holdings just to see whether they did hold any of these actual nuclear weapons producing companies. And I must say the overall theme of our research throughout this is a real lack of transparency.
Yeah, right. And Bill, you work in our democracy and accountability program. Did the results shock you? And do you think the results would shock most Australians? Do people know where their super is invested?
I'm afraid to say the results didn't particularly shock me. The lack of transparency is not unusual in the sector. That is hopefully set to change, and it's something that consumers should insist on changing when they see their money put to work for purposes that they may not agree with. We've tested Australians just last month on their expectations around their superannuation and nuclear weapons producers. And I think it's safe to say that they will be shocked when these results are out. We find that of Australians who have superannuation, 7 in 10 do not know whether their super fund is invested in nuclear weapons.
That's a big chunk of people.
That's a big chunk of people, and they'd be right to be uncertain about it because, as we found, many of them are invested. We also asked Australians whether they wanted their superannuation invested in nuclear weapons. And again, 7 in 10 say they don't. So that's a clear kind of message for superannuation funds that they are out of step with their own customers. As Margaret mentioned, many superannuation funds say that they don't invest in controversial weapons, which is a perfectly nice sentiment, but we found that, once again, 7 in 10 Australians expected nuclear weapons to be included in a definition of controversial weapons. So if they see that their superannuation fund does not invest in controversial weapons, they're going to be potentially misled and assume that it doesn't include nuclear as well.
Yeah, I would certainly assume that much.
I mean, you'd have to think nuclear weapons are one of the most controversial ever invented.
Absolutely.
And finally, just on the call for transparency, 4 in 5 Australians would expect their superannuation fund to disclose if it did have nuclear weapons holdings. So there's a clear mandate for this kind of stuff to be public.
Yeah. Margaret, coming back to you, reading through the report, it looks like Australian Super, which is one of the biggest funds, is certainly invested in companies involved in nuclear weapons. But how much transparency is there in the findings about exactly how much super funds are invested in these companies? How much do we know about the quantum involved?
We looked at over 20 funds And in only 3 were we able to be precise about how much money they had invested. And all the others, we had to just rely on voting records and other sort of indicators that didn't actually give us a sense of how much money was involved. Australian super is incredibly disappointing.
I work hard for my money, and that's why I'm happy that being with Australian Super feels more like I'm in a circle than a super fund. A circle with more than 2.2 million other Australians, all powering our futures together.
It is one of the biggest super funds. And what's interesting, though, even though they have a lot of money involved in nuclear weapons producers, compared to the size of their holdings, it's a really tiny amount. And if there's sort of evidence that it's not going to damage their returns if they get rid of these weapons. It's quite clear that for the size of the investment as a percentage, it's immaterial to their returns. So funds can still, it's really consistent with their fiduciary duty, their sort of duty to get good money back and look after their fund members' savings. If you get rid of these nuclear weapons producers, it will make negligible or possibly positive results on returns.
And you're obviously a huge part of the Quit Nukes campaign. If you had all these superannuation funds in a room, what would you be asking them to do?
Well, I should, just before I go to that, say that there are 6 funds that are really leading the way. So Active Super, Australian Ethical, Christian Super, Crescent Wealth, Future Super and Verve Super, all clearly without nuclear weapons. And during the course of this research, we've got another fund that's looking at divesting next year, another 2 funds who are, so that's Host Plus, and then Aware and CBIS are certainly going to be reviewing their policies in the new year. So there's change afoot, and that's certainly reflected globally as well. There's a lot of divestment happening globally, and that again is outlined in the report. What would I say if all these funds were in the room? The first thing I would say is that nuclear weapons are clearly controversial weapons. There's no question about that, and they need to address that. A lot of the funds exclude controversial weapons across their whole portfolio, and nuclear weapons are probably the worst of all the controversial weapons in terms of what they do for people. So that would be my first step. And for the second one, for the funds that don't exclude controversial weapons at all, that includes a lot of the private funds like ANZ and IOOF and MLC, well, shame on you. You really shouldn't be funding these appalling weapons that kill civilians at scale and then cause, untold damage for generations. So I would say, firstly, nuclear weapons are controversial weapons, and that's the first step.
And certainly, I would imagine most Australians would agree that nuclear weapons are controversial weapons.
If you're Muslim and care about where your retirement wealth is invested, you don't have many options. You can leave it with your existing super fund that invests in all sorts of haram industries, such as riba, alcohol, weapons manufacturing, nuclear weapons, gambling and more.
Verve was founded by women to support women to build wealth and invest in a better world.
Liam, Margaret there talked about the super funds that are doing the right thing. But when it comes to doing the right thing, obviously, Margaret's laid out what needs to happen for those that aren't, but what does it look like when you are doing right things? Are they just divesting entirely? Are they really clear in their policies? What makes the difference between the super funds that are doing the right thing?
Yeah, sure. So there are a few key factors that we think that all funds should be doing in order to be, responsible actors in this space and not be funding these weapons of mass destruction. And the first one is obviously to divest from these companies. These are companies that are producing some of the most controversial and dangerous weapons that the world has ever seen. A really simple step is to divest from those companies. They often represent a very, very small amount of a superannuation fund's investment universe, sometimes around 0.5%, for example. So it's not a massive step to take to divest from those. On top of that, we also think that these super funds should be assessing their holdings and reporting them publicly. So as I mentioned before, one of the key themes out of our research here was the real lack of transparency. And superannuation is one of those great Australian projects. We're amassing this wealth for Australians to retire on, and we're entrusting that money to these superannuation funds to invest wisely and invest responsibly as well. And I think that for the vast majority of Australians who just want to see good returns on their product, but also want to see good social returns and good environmental returns potentially, they are not going to be impressed by seeing all of their money invested in this particular way. So there should be transparency in that regard, and it should be listed publicly. And on top of that, we should also see a lot of these companies excluded from any investment by these funds regardless of their threshold as well. And what I mean by that is that there are very, very few nuclear weapons producers in the world that derive their entire income from nuclear weapons. A lot of them have vast portfolios. A lot of them derive only a very small amount of their income from nuclear weapons, sometimes less than 1% potentially. And what we're finding is that a lot of these funds are skirting around the edge of responsible investment principles by setting an investment threshold that says they won't invest in any nuclear weapons companies as long as they don't derive more than, say, 5% of their revenue from nuclear weapons companies. Now, there are very, very few companies that actually do that. So what we're saying is that all funds should have a policy that excludes nuclear weapons companies, regardless of how much of their income is derived from it.
Yeah.
If you go with Australian Ethical, you're not investing in they invest in 75% less CO2 than other investors. So for me, that's pretty incredible. Better than that, they're also investing in us. They're investing in rainforest protection. So this September, for every person that actually signs up to Australian Ethical, part of our Triple Switch for Earth divestment campaign, you're going to save 2 square metres of this incredible Daintree rainforest.
Bill, how does this fit into overall moves for transparency within superannuation? Because obviously there's other divestment movements out there, plenty around fossil fuels, for example, but also just ethical investment in general. Where does this kind of fit?
Well, the good news is that more transparency is coming in the new year. I think by March, we'll expect superannuation funds to be disclosing more details about what companies they actually are invested in. So that'll be a good moment for investors, Australians, to reconsider what superannuation company their money is with and whether it's going to exactly the kinds of investments that each person is comfortable with. I think you're right too that this is part of a broader divestment movement, and we're increasingly seeing a trend of people expecting their money to go to causes that they support. It's particularly acute for climate change and nuclear weapons because in both cases, the investor's own life is intimately caught up in whether companies act on the threat of nuclear war or the threat of climate change. So they have a very personal stake. We also see growing consumer concern about supply chain issues like slavery in the supply chain, how workers are treated and so on. So I think this is just the start of a big movement by regular mum and dad investors getting their money into places where it does the most good.
Yeah. And Margaret, just to finish with you, that's kind of how this report fits into, ethical investment in the superannuation industry. But how does this focus on superannuation fit into the general campaign to abolish nuclear weapons?
I think it's all part of the change in norms that the new treaties really highlighted. These weapons they've always been immoral, now they're actually illegal. And I think it's really about stigmatising these weapons, getting people to understand that they are totally unacceptable. And as I said, most people will be astonished to find their superannuation money is contributing to these weapons being built. So I think the trend globally is clear. In 2021, there were 338 financial institutions investing, and last year it was 390, so it's dropped by 52. So this divestment movement is gaining momentum. There's a lot of funds doing it overseas, and it will add to the pressure on these nuclear weapons producers to recognise that these weapons are unacceptable.
Well, hopefully sooner rather than later. Thanks very much for an excellent report. Thank you to Margaret, Bill and Liam for joining me today. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 7th of December, 2021, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, including this report, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _NTT. Bill Brown is at Brown with an E 90. Margaret Beavis is at Margaret Beavis, and Liam is at
Liam Carter _AU.
This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and you can find her at Jennifer Macy. Additional editing from Elisa Kloser. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.